They did want it back.
Although I'm sure some people will drift in, I think we better get started so that we don't keep you here too long. So tonight we are going to be talking about revisiting the English Reformation, history and historiography. Now I know that everybody knows what history is. It comes from the Greek. Hysteria means inquiry, so it is an inquiry into the past. Historiography is, of course, about the people who write history. In other words, when you do a historiographical study, you look at the historian and you try to determine what prejudices, what slants, what ideas may affect how that historian is writing history. So we're going to look at the history of the English Reformation, and then we're going to look at some of the historiographical issues that lie behind it. Now, I know most of you are familiar with the way the English Reformation worked, but we're just going to go over the basics, okay? So, you'll remember that there was a king named Henry VII who defeated Richard III on Bosworth Field, the only time an English king has taken the crown in battle. Henry VII took over a kingdom that had very limited money in the coffers. He was very interested in making some money and filling up those coffers. And one of the ways that you could do that, of course, especially if you had, went too fast, if you had two sons, was to marry them off and get the dowry. So Henry VII has two sons, Arthur and Henry, and he has a prospect, Catherine of Aragon. She's got lots of money, and so he engages his son Arthur to Catherine. She comes over. They are married on November 14th, 1501. Arthur is 15, Catherine is 16. Arthur dies, unfortunately, 6 months later. Now, Henry VII does not want that dowry to go back over the channel. It is about, I think, and that's a rough estimate. It's impossible to really estimate what a gold ducat in the 15th, 16th century was worth. But it's around, between 20 and 30 million dollars. And he's gotten half of it. And he wants the other half, all right? So he doesn't want Catherine to go home. So he starts thinking about alternatives. And of course, he does have an alternative. He's got another son, Henry. Now, Henry is younger, but he is eligible. And so after Henry VII's death, he's going to be made king. And he is married to Catherine on June 11th, 1509, 7 years after Arthur's death. They are anointed and crowned on June 24th, and for all the evidence, it is a happy and loving marriage. When you look at it, there are lots of accounts which have them hunting together, partying together. When he has to leave the country on a military expedition, she actually takes the army, the English army, to defend it against the Scottish army, defend the country. She is, she's capable, he trusts her. All the accounts suggest that it is a very happy and successful and loving marriage. But there's the rub. 1510 to 1518, she has 4 miscarriages. One son lives less than 2 months, and she has one daughter that survives, Mary Tudor. I want you to think about that for a minute. I want you to think about an 8-year period and a woman who's continually pregnant and losing a child. And I want you to think about the psychological devastation, the toll that must have taken on her. And Henry, it's not costing him a thing. He's out hunting and carrying on and having a very good time. But she is continually going through both physical and mental devastation. And so it is no wonder that he begins to have something of a wandering eye. And the eye settles on Anne Boleyn. And in 1526, Henry begins his pursuit. Now, Anne was raised at the French court. She was fluent in French. She also had some Protestant leanings. She wants to avoid the fate of her older sister Mary, who was one of Henry's mistresses. And she was one who didn't quite make it. He put her aside. So Anne goes to school on that fact. She realizes that the one thing that she really wants to do is not to have Henry in her bed. She wants him to desire her, but she wants him to wait until they can get married. Well, now this is a significant problem, as most of you know, because Henry is married to his older brother's sister, and in order for that to happen,
Older brother's wife.
wife, excuse me. In order for that to happen, they had to get papal dispensation. So the Pope signed off on the fact that the marriage between Arthur and Catherine was not valid. And now Henry is asking the Pope to say that the marriage between Catherine and himself is not valid. And popes do not like to change their minds. Now, popes especially do not like to change their mind when Catherine's nephew, who is Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe, has an army in the north of Italy. So the Pope is not necessarily enthusiastic about granting Henry VIII the annulment that he wants. So he begins to stall, and Henry becomes increasingly impatient. He tries all sorts of ploys. He tries all sorts of diplomatic ploys. He sends an upcoming young cleric named Thomas Cranmer, who we'll come to see in a minute. He sends him off to all the universities of Europe to try to get all the learned professors to say that he should get an annulment. And he pays them, he bribes them. And they say, sure, we'll tell the Pope. Well, the Pope doesn't care about the academic credentials. He cares about Charles V's army. And so he continues to stall. So in the end, Henry takes a drastic step. He commits an act of supremacy in 1534. And the act of supremacy is passed on November 3rd. It makes him the supreme head of the church, replacing the Pope. He has a chancellor named Thomas More, who you may know from the fame of the book Utopia. More is how many of you saw Man for All Seasons?
Yeah.
Okay, great movie, not terribly accurate. Thomas More is painted out to be a lovely, sensitive, learned man. Well, he could be a real bastard. And he had some acts committed against what he regarded as Protestant, activists. He had them tortured, he had them murdered. So he has a lot to reckon with. He's not the bright and shining star of the Man for All Seasons, but he was a dedicated and thoughtful and faithful Catholic, Roman Catholic. And with the act of supremacy, everybody who had a political or a ecclesiastical post had to sign an oath of allegiance, saying that they supported the act of supremacy. And More realized, he at that particular time was Lord Chancellor, and he realized that unless he signed that, he was in serious trouble. And he was. And he continued to try to argue that it really, he wasn't doing it because he was unfaithful or treacherous or traitorous. But eventually, Henry got tired of his balking, and he put him in the tower. And of course, eventually he was executed on the 6th of July, 1535. So, we have the Act of Supremacy, and now what begins is the first phase of what many people call the English Reformation. And those are two of the people who, of course, had an enormous influence. Thomas Cranmer on the left, Archbishop of Canterbury from 1533 to 1555, and Thomas Cromwell, who replaced Thomas More as chief minister from 1534 to 1540. And you might think that Thomas Cranmer was sort of in charge of the religious side and Cromwell the political or social side, and that wouldn't be actually accurate. Cromwell, who was probably more dedicated to the Protestant cause, the reforming cause, than Cranmer, passed any number and pushed Henry to take all sorts of steps to further the reformation of the English church. What were some of those steps? Pressing the wrong one. Well, there were reforming acts. The most significant one being 1536 to 1541, the dissolution of the monasteries. So Henry sent out a group of learned men, both clerics and lay persons, to go visit all the monasteries and all the nunneries in the land. And they were to make a report on their health and well-being, and they came back, understandably, with horror stories of what was going on. There were all sorts of sinful relationships. The monasteries were corrupt. The nunneries were no less than brothels. It was a scandal. And so he gave him all the firepower he needed to suppress the monasteries and the nunneries. And why? Well, they were incredibly wealthy and had lots of holdings of land and money and buildings. And of course, all that was confiscated went right into the royal coffers. So this was an enormous boon, economic boon, for Henry's reign, that allowed him to do a great deal of things. There was also the cult of the saints was suppressed. Now, again, and we'll talk about this more as we go along, but the cult of the saints was an enormously important part of the fabric of religious life in England. And again, we will speak more about this as we go along, but when you look at the medieval English Catholic Church, there was this understanding of a kind of eternal reality that existed now. The dead were as present as the living. The saints were there. They lived in a almost supernatural environment in which, the lines between living and dead, between saints and petitioners, they were really blurred. And so the cult of the saints was incredibly important, and Henry, through the advice of Cromwell and others, began to suppress the cult. The other thing was that, all these saints had feast days. And guess what? On feast days, you didn't have to work. So you got the day off. So by suppressing feast days, it was as much of an economic move as it was a spiritual one. And it was not popular, as you can imagine, with the people. What else happened? Well, there was iconoclasm, there was prohibition of pilgrimages. Some of you, if you've ever been to Ely Cathedral in Norfolk, Ely has a beautiful lady chapel that's filled with stained glass. It's all plain glass now. Many people go in, assume that it was done under the time of Oliver Cromwell, but it was actually done during his time. Cromwell, but with Henry's blessing, sent out a group of people, as he did with surveying the monasteries, to go and check out all the local cults, all the local relics, all the local images that people he felt were worshiping inappropriately, and have them destroyed. And he had one firebrand named Hugh Latimer, who headed this, and Hugh took a group of people out and began destroying, various not only reliquaries and relics, but not as much stained glass as happened later, but some stained glass, a lot of images, a lot of statues of saints and roods. Rood screens, everybody know what a rood screen is? Okay, nave, well, we'll see what in a minute. Nave, chancel, altar, and usually separating the nave where the people are and the chancel and altar, there's a screen. It's not necessarily a covered screen, but it usually has, and on top of it is generally the crucified Christ. All right, that's the rood. And so that's why the rood screen got its name.
It's a double O rood, not a R-U-D.
Double O rood. And saints' shrines, liturgical and devotional objects are all defaced and destroyed. And in 1538, Thomas Cromwell issues an edict prohibiting pilgrimages. Now, pilgrimage, yes.
Just back a second. Why are they destroying this? What's the rationale?
The rationale is that they think that they become objects of superstition, that the people are inappropriately, and this happens on the European Reformation as well. The understanding is that Roman Catholicism has fostered a cultic understanding of both objects and individuals, which detracts from a reliance on Christ's sacrifice and salvific act, and instead focuses people's attentions on trying to superstitiously invoke the aid of various saints and objects. And is it true? Well, we'll continue to look at it as we go along. But certainly, as far as the reformers were concerned, they were destroying objects of superstition that needed to be reformed because they led people astray. Okay? Now, Henry, was he really a religious reformer? Not so sure. A lot of historians argue that had Henry lived longer, he would have returned the church to Rome. He was very conservative in both his liturgical and devotional life. He went along with a lot of these provisions and a lot of this destruction, primarily because it was profitable. But as far as the liturgy was concerned, as far as his theology was concerned, he was very conservative. You may have heard one of his titles, Defender of the Faith. The Queen is still, well, what do you think that means? That was actually given him by the Pope. Because he wrote early on, before all this happened, he wrote a treatise against Martin Luther. And the Pope gave him the title, Defender of the Faith, because of that act. So Henry was definitely a ecclesiastical and a religious conservative. And I think it is a justifiable argument that had he lived longer as things were evolving, he might well have put a stop to the Reformation and restored the English Church's relationship with Rome. But he did. And he was succeeded in 1547 by his only son, by Jane Seymour, Edward VI. Now, Edward had been tutored and taught by reformers. Primarily, he had been tutored and taught by the Duke of Northumberland and the Duke of Somerset, Edward Seymour and John Dudley. And he had been brought up in a reforming tradition, and with his ascension, reformers are far more in control and begin a program of suppression of both Catholic and traditionalist practice. Now, of course, it's during this period of Edward that we have the Reformation of the liturgy. This is Thomas Cranmer's most lasting legacy. And the first prayer book is published in 1549, the second in 1552. It is the liturgy in English, which it had not been before. It had a rite for Holy Communion. It did not, the 1549 was not, it was certainly Protestant in its tone and its tradition, but it was relatively conservative. When we get to the re-editing and reissuing of 1552, Cranmer has gone more Protestant. And he's put a number of things. Did any of you ever see a wonderful movie called Shakespeare in Love? Okay. I was astonished when I saw that, because rarely do I see movie makers taking their history seriously. But just to give you an idea of the kind of changes that took place, there was a scene in there, if you remember, where Shakespeare goes into a church and there's a Eucharist going on. But when you look at the Eucharist, it's very strange, because you have a medieval church. So you have the nave, the rood screen, the chancel, and the altar. But there, in the middle of the chancel, with the choir stalls on both sides, there's a long dining room table, okay, a wooden table. And that is the altar. And the priest stands on the north side. They don't want anybody thinking about stone altars, that implies sacrifice. They don't want the priest, people thinking anything about sacrifice. They don't want them thinking about, oh, he's got to face east. No, the minister faces north, standing there. And in, no chasuble, none of that stuff, surplice, that's it. And there is a simple cup and a simple plate. And they depicted that in that movie, which I thought was incredibly good. But that is what the 1552 prayer book suggested. That's the setting. They were out to dismantle all the trappings of the Roman Catholic medieval piety. All right? So 1552 was a major step in that direction. But of course, it doesn't last that long, because Edward is a sickly child, and he dies. He dies in 1558. The church has been shaken up, and we'll talk more about that later. We'll talk more about some of the other things that went on during his reign. But he initially, knowing that Henry VIII had excluded his daughters from the succession, Mary and Elizabeth, but then before he died, he had reinstalled them so that they were in line. But Edward, realizing, and his counselors realizing that that would put Mary on the throne, tried to do an end run and put Lady Jane Grey, who had an impeccable royal pedigree, and tried to make her queen when Edward died. She came into London. She ruled, so to speak, from July 10th to 19th. Mary had gone up to her stronghold in Norfolk and had raised an army and was starting to come down, and Lady Jane Grey quickly understood that she had no leg to stand on and no army to combat with. And so she surrendered and was executed. So Mary Tudor becomes queen. She marries Philip II, King of Spain, enormously powerful individual. And they are married from 1554 to her death in 1558. It was not a popular marriage with English people. They did not like the Spaniard, and he didn't spend a lot of time in England. And I think it really contributed a great deal to Mary's unpopularity. She was assisted by Bishop Stephen Gardiner, who had been around for a long time and survived both the Honretian reforms and Edward. He was Lord Chancellor, and then Cardinal Reginald Pole who was a papal legate, who was very influential. And Mary, of course, embarks on her own re-reformation of the English church, guided by both of those gentlemen, but particularly by Pole. And again, we'll talk more about what historians have done with this event and how they've spun it, so to speak, in a minute. So, now we're going to go from history to historiography. But before we go there, does anybody have any questions about the basic flow? Mary dies, Elizabeth becomes queen, great queen. All right.
I have a similar question though. If they were destroying all these churches, how did some of the great cathedrals in England, like Lincoln Cathedral?
They didn't destroy the churches, they destroyed the images, and they destroyed the paintings, they destroyed the paraphernalia within. They didn't destroy the building itself. Although they destroyed a lot of the monasteries. I mean, if you've been to Fountains or, Revaux, you see these marvelous ruins of Cistercian monasteries. So now, historiography. Martin Luther, no less a figure than Martin Luther, as he was championing and directing the Reformation, he realized, he said to some of his supporters, he said, the battle of the Reformation will not be fought on theological or scriptural battlefields. The battle of the Reformation will be fought on historical record. He knew that history was the real battlefield between Protestant and Roman Catholics. Now, why? Well, I always tell people, if you look back through church history and you look at various disputes that occur between different factors, and you look at the basis of their argument, and one makes this point, one makes that point. Well, who wins? Well, if I can turn to you and say, the early church did it, I win. Okay, that's the trump card. If I can prove through the historical record that this tradition or this understanding, this theological perception goes back to the early church, goes back to the apostles' church, then I win. So I think that, in a nutshell, is what Luther saw. And so he began to tell people, we need to start shaping the historical battlefield. So he gets a number of his colleagues, particularly, well, I'll show you in a minute, but the Magdeburg centuries are the first salvo, so to speak, in the historical war. And they are, but I think I had a picture of them, but I may not have. Nope. They are written by a group of Lutheran scholars. And one, the Matthias Flacius, is the head of it. And they produced these over the course of 1559 to 1574. And basically it paints a picture of a very Protestant, early church, and it slants early church history in a way that shows that it is the rightful and significant and purposeful progenitor of Protestant church. So the Catholics have to answer. And so they hire a cardinal named Caesar Baronius, and he begins to write the Annals Ecclesiastici, and that's produced from 1588 to 1607. And it is a major work, and we can talk about it more if you have any questions about it. But for now, it's just to notice that this is the first salvo on the part of both these combating religious organizations on the field of history. Now, when it comes to English Protestant history, so the Reformation has taken place. Elizabeth now is on the throne, but while Mary's still on the throne, Fox begins to produce his Acts and Monuments, which comes out actually during her reign, but The definitive edition comes out in 1570. Fox's Acts and Monuments is a collation and collection of all the stories of those who were martyred, the Protestant martyrs under Mary. And it is a work of hagiography. These people are made into real saints of the Protestant cause. And so this is the first salvo, so to speak, showing that actually, the Roman Catholic Church, particularly under Mary, was corrupt and ruthless and not of God, and that the true saints of the church were those who she martyred. And you can see on the page all the pictures of burnings and things of that sort. So then you begin to have this understanding of we need to produce histories that show why the Protestant cause was right, why the Protestant cause not only was able to succeed, but should succeed, because it was the proper, true, and God-given religion. And so when you get down to the 18th century, Gilbert Burnet later became a bishop, but he wrote the history of the Reformation, the Church of England. And in the 19th century, we had James Anthony Froude's History of England, published from 1850 to 1870. Now, what do these books have in common? Well, at the risk of oversimplification, they're basically creating a story of the English Reformation, which goes something like this. The Roman Catholic Church was, on the eve of the Reformation, a corrupt and sinful and ineffective institution, which basically chained people to superstitious practice, manipulated them. The people were just like they, blackened the reputation of the monasteries and the convents. They blackened the understanding of the church. These were people who were totally under the control of the Pope and the Pope's agents. And the Reformation was God's gift to the English people. The Reformation brought light into this darkness. The Reformation brought God's holiness back into the Church of England. And they're all sort of creating narratives that basically follow that kind of line, so that they blacken as much as they possibly can the Roman Catholic Church, its practices, its understandings, and they present the Reformation as something that happened. And the minute that it happened, the minute that the Reformation began to shone on the English continent, the people flocked to it because they were so tired of the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church. And they could see that this was a decadent body that needed to be purged. So to varying degrees and to varying levels of historical sophistication, that's the argument that is made in a lot of those works. Whoop, wrong way. Whoop. That is Froude, and that is the copy of the title page to Burnet's Reformation of the Church of England. And of course, there you've got Cranmer on one side and Henry VIII on the other. Now we're going to jump into the present day. And as you can see here, we have a copy of the English Reformation, second edition, written by a scholar named A.G. Dickens. He was a prominent historian in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, publishing in 1967 his analysis of the English Reformation, which becomes the standard text on the subject for many years, going through several editions and used in a textbook in innumerable university courses and classrooms. I got it. I was raised on Dickens. And Dickens' analysis it's good history. I'm not trying to tell you that this man was not a first-rate historian, but he's certainly in line with his English predecessors. And he is basically saying that the church in England at the time of the beginning of the 16th century was a corrupt institution in definite need of correction and reformation. And he also wants to make the point that the Reformation itself was greeted by the people very quickly, rapidly, and completely. So he wants to show that this once the Reformation took hold, it was very popular and very quick to spread, and that it did not in any way, shape, or form restrict the piety of the people, and that Mary's reign was something of a hiccup, which slowed it up, but certainly did not dampen the people's enthusiasm for the Reformed Church. So Dickens becomes sort of the prominent historian, and his line is picked up by many historians of the period until Eamon Duffy. That is the book, The Stripping of the Altars, which is produced in 1982. Eamon Duffy was at the University of London, but then he went to Cambridge to take up a post-teaching there in 1982. And he had his first PhD student, which would be me. So Eamon was my advisor and tutor. He had not produced, it was 10 years later that he produced Stripping of the Altars. And he's now become, of course, one of the most well-known and prominent historians on the English scene. Stripping of the Altars, Eamon, by the way, is a layman. He's a Roman Catholic, raised in Ireland. So Eamon goes back and he begins to ask some very different questions, and he begins to use some very different historical resources. He begins to question the fact, was the medieval Roman Catholic Church really that corrupt? Were the people really duped by, priestly pietistic practices? And he begins to look at an interesting collection of different materials. Wrong way. He begins to go and look at architectural detail, architectural designs, old wall paintings that existed. There's a rood screen for you right there. He begins to do a lot of research on what happened architecturally to the parish churches in England during this time of the early 16th century all the way up through the Reformation. He begins to look at parish records and to see who was supporting who was giving the church money. Were all these people immediately put off by the Roman Catholic Church when the Reformation came? Did they stop their support? Did they stop their religious practices? Did they begin to change their liturgies themselves? Was this really a popular movement? So he begins to look at images and interiors, and he begins to find that no, the parishes did not do a turnaround on a dime. A lot of them had very convoluted and very a great deal of difficulty getting on board with the Reformation, and a lot of them openly resisted. He also looked at primers and processions. Again, one of the questions he was asking is, was the Roman Catholic Church on the eve of the Reformation, was it really this corrupt, spiritless entity? What sort of spiritual resources did the church provide for their parishioners, their constituents? And he began to sort of combat the persistent notion that, the Roman Catholic lay people were not really well educated, that they didn't really understand what they were doing, that everything was in Latin, and so they, had no idea what was going on. And he began to take it apart and say, no, these people actually had a very rich religious and spiritual life. That many of them had primers, beautiful books, that they may not have been fluent in Latin, but they could read it, they could understand it. Again, the images, The images were not just there didactically, they were there to tie them to their faith and to their church. He began to look at the processions, which, again, these processions were much more than simply some kind of empty, parade to a saint. They were the kind of events that tied the community together, which gave them a communal identity, which provided them with a way not only to worship or praise the saint, but to provide them with a kind of bonding. He looked at wills and guilds. Thomas Cromwell had suppressed all religious guilds in the 1530s and 40s. They were enormously important, the religious guild. Some were non-religious trade guilds, but there were a number that were in the parish church, and they provided the parish with a stream of income. They often supported various ministries of the church. They helped keep up the decoration and the trappings of the church. So guilds were very important. Wills are very interesting. Dickens and various other Protestant scholars had tried to make an argument that when it used to be in the medieval era, when you started off your will, you would have sort of a preface there, which would say, I give my soul to my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and ask for the prayers of St. Anthony and St. Blaise and and you'd list all your favorite saints, and that would be sort of the preface before you really got down to business. And we see that during the middle of the 16th century, a lot of that language goes away. And A.G. Dickens and others had argued that that is a clear indication that people were buying into the Protestant cause and were rejecting and leaving the cult of the saints. And Eamon came up with a lot of evidence showing, no, that's not the case. It was more of a fashionable change in legal language, and that people simply, stopped doing that, but it wasn't necessarily indicative of their religious allegiance or religious beliefs. So basically, what we have is a historian, and Eamon's book now is 30 years old. It's been reissued twice, and now is available on Audible. And one of the things that Eamon says in the preface to the third edition, he talks about how delighted he was when he would go into London, and he'd ride the tube in London, and here were people actually reading this thick, thick book on stripping the altars. But it enjoyed an incredible popularity. And basically what it is trying to say is that we can't look at the Reformation as an event that happened quickly or happened with unilateral support, that it was a very complicated phenomenon which had a variety of layers and had a long and involved and complex historical evolution. Basically, one of Eamon's arguments is that, he again, in the historical debate, a lot of people say, well, look, England did go back to Roman Catholicism and it didn't work, well, that's not necessarily true. Eamon points out that the Marian Church actually was welcomed in any number of counties in England, and that people were very eager to go back. One of the things that happened, of course, is when the Reformation came, if you're in a parish church, the crown would come in and say, okay, give me all your chalices, give me all your vestments, give me all your candles, give me all your candle holders, your pyxes, all the accoutrement of Catholic worship. And they would take them, and sometimes the people would try to sell them before the government got them. And they tore down rood screens. They did a lot of destruction of these parish churches and the fabric of the religious practice and worship of the day. When Mary came in, there was this complete turnaround, of course, and everybody had to go out and try to buy him again. And they did it without reluctance. There were some pockets of Protestant resistance, as there were, when the Protestants were in control, pockets of Roman Catholic resistance. But, you know, on the whole, people were happy to go back and put the rood screen back up and pay for it and bring the font back in, because that was thrown out as well, the stone font, and to try to sort of refurbish their parish church. But then Mary dies. Guess what? Elizabeth comes in. Elizabeth, she's not as Protestant as Edward, but she's moving back into a more Protestant direction. And Eamon's argument is that Mary's changes might have been successful had she had more time. And then what Elizabeth did, she had time. And the people were tired. The people were tired of this sort of back and forth of religious issues and religious practices and religious leadership. So that, you know, once Elizabeth got in there and brought a sense of stability, and she did go back, she you know, brought in a more conservative liturgy than the 1552, and she made several other changes that brought the church back to more of a middle ground. And so, you know, Eamon's argument is that, yeah, the people were tired. Now the people were ready to have a reformed church. But in another book that I read a few months ago, the author argues that the real success of the Reformation didn't occur until the 17th century. All right, I've talked way too much. You have questions, comments, remarks for the good of the order? No, I've stunned you into silence. Yes.
As I look at reforms, not just this reform, but you take any kind of reform movement, whether it's religious or political or whatever, usually and you take, for example, the Taliban, you know, moving into Buddhist temples. You know, it's a power and control issue. You know, I'm gonna have the power, but I'm gonna get rid of your symbols first.
Mhm.
You know, it was like when the Greek statues or the Egyptian statues all have the noses knocked off.
Mhm.
You know, why? Because that was a symbol of the power, and they had to destroy the symbols in order to exert their power in return. So it seems so much like this is much more of a symbolic move, as a power move versus a real reform of liturgy and a real understanding of Christ. I don't hear much Christ in it. I hear a lot of, you know, symbolism that
No, there's certainly theological debates that are going on that are very important. Iconoclasm, as you point out, you know, is a very frequent presence in any kind of Reformation and in institutional development. I mean, you look at the iconoclastic period in Christian art, you know, in the 8th and the 7th century. And the destruction, I mean, we lost almost all the Christian art in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And so, yeah, it's an easy and very effective way to attack the religious fabric of the opposition. You know, go for their most visible and evident source of power statement.
You didn't mention Mary Queen of Scots, and at the time of Elizabeth, I mean, you have the Catholic and the Protestant constantly coming up against each other.
Mhm.
You had armies raised by both of them. You had.
Sure, I mean, Mary Queen of Scots is, I mean, she's I guess I didn't go there because as far as the history of the Reformation is concerned, Mary Queen of Scots doesn't have that much of a role to play.
Okay.
In the political situation, she certainly does, and in the stability of Elizabeth's reign, She certainly has a direct impact. But you know, and one of the questions that often is asked is, people say, well, after all, we call her Bloody Mary. Well, you know, yes, Mary did execute a lot of people, but so did Elizabeth. You know, one of the reasons, you know, for example, I don't know if you know this or not, but you know, we don't make saints in the Episcopal Church, but we do have a calendar, and the way that we honor somebody, the way that we suggest that this person is a paradigm of either faith or learning or spirituality, is we give them a day. We just celebrated one of my favorite, George Herbert, you know, at the Evensong. And that is a decision that is made by the General Convention of the Episcopal Church, whether to put somebody on the calendar or not. And there have been a number of times when people have tried to put Elizabeth first. She never made it, because people say we can't put her up as a paradigm because of the executions that she engineered during her reign.
I missed out. I learned a lot because I hadn't realised a lot of the things you were talking about. I knew about the dissolution of the monasteries, but not the extent. I thought that was much later on. I thought the whole thing with Elizabeth was a compromise. And that the whole idea of the Church of England, the way I'd understood it, probably from reading too many historical novels, was that you have, the whole service is the Catholic service, but you knock out the Pope, you put the monarch in, you change the doctrine of transubstantiation, and you got it. And it was trying to please as many people as possible, which is obviously not the case.
Well, there certainly is compromise, and Elizabeth was very skillful at walking a fine line. You know, for example, there's all sorts of wonderful stories about Elizabeth. Many of them, I'm sure, are apocryphal. But two of my favorites are that when she came to Westminster Abbey, and Westminster Abbey had been decidedly sort of high church and still, you know, had an aura of that. And so they went out to greet her with candles. Well, candles are a very dicey ecclesiastical accompaniment these days. I mean, candles, the reformers wanted to get rid of all candles. They didn't want candles burning in front of people, they didn't want candles used in liturgy, you know, this was something. And so Elizabeth's confronted with the fact that if she allows this and goes on, so she turns to people and she says, I can see perfectly well, you can put the candles out. But the other one that I dearly love is she supposedly said, and when she was asked about her reforming, that she did not want to make windows into men's souls. She didn't care about what you believed. She cared about what you did. She wanted everybody in church. And she wanted to make sure that the churches were there and filled with her people and that they were praying for the Queen. And so that was her religious political agenda. And the Elizabethan settlement was incredibly successful at creating that kind of environment. She did not let doctrinal controversies get out of control, but she was very firm in her own reformed understanding, and she was very dedicated to the prayer book and the worship of the Church of England. But she allowed, you know, some wiggle room for those who wanted candles, for those who wanted pictures, for those who wanted pilgrimages. Anything else?
While this was going on in England, there was there a growth of the Protestant church also in Europe and the Netherlands at this time?
Sure.
That was sort of part and parcel with the.
Well, there is. Yes, you know, of course, the European, the Reformation is taking place all across Europe to varying degrees. But you also, of course, have, especially at this time when we looked at Caesar Baronius, and in the 1570s, you have what we call the Counter-Reformation, which is the Roman Catholic Church, is understanding that they have been attacked, so to speak, by the Protestant churches and Protestant forces. And so they begin to try to get their act together and create an atmosphere of reform within their own church that can combat this new understanding, new learning, new liturgy. And the Council of Trent goes on for a long time, but does try to create a body of theology and a body of politics that can enable the church to reassert its integrity and its spirituality. Thank you all. Oh, next time, we skip next week, and then we come back the week after, and we're gonna talk about, I promise you, what, it's the week after, isn't it?
Yeah, one more week, you're on, and then the next week is the Ukraine, the 14th.
Oh, I thought next week was Ukraine.
No,
Please come next
14th.
week.
Oh, it's the 14th, so it's next week,
So, no, let's see, next week is the 7th, you're on,
okay,
the week after that is the Ukraine concert,
okay.
and
So-
then you finish up the week after that.
Next week, if you thought this was an interesting story, if it appealed to you at all, next week we're gonna talk about the establishment of the Episcopal Church in the United States of America. And it is fun.
There's one more chai up here, please make it so that it does fit.